As many of you know, in the fall of 2016, I took a sabbatical leave to work on putting together a collection of essays on gender and grief in the Middle Ages. The collection, Knowing Sorrow, Grief and Gender and Identity in the Middle Ages, is under contract for publication with Brill as part of their Explorations in Medieval Culture series. The manuscript is long past due. I will talk about the project and the experience of editing a collection such as this in a moment, but I want to begin by discussing why I chose to devote my work as a medieval scholar, I use that term extremely loosely, on issues of grief, gender, and identity. As scholars, our work is not, despite what we may sometimes think, solely in an intellectual endeavor. That is, our work is often connected to our lived experiences, informed by our personal histories, a fact we don't acknowledge enough. Usually, when asked what my scholarship focuses on, I offer a brief and less than comprehensive response. It's about medieval masculinity and grief, I say. To most, this sounds like an unnecessarily depressing topic, and such a response is met with a thoughtful look, an understanding nod of the head, and a general loss of words. It seems that nobody knows what to say. At this point, I usually feel a little sorry for whomever I am talking to and offer a remark which I hope will put them at ease. Sounds like a pair of laughs, doesn't it? I quip. And that ends the discussion. The person who asked the question is relieved that she doesn't have to hear about a subject which, judging from the description I just gave, would probably ruin her perfectly enjoyable day, or, at the least, dampen her spirits for a while. And I am glad that I don't have to go into why I chose such a topic with which to spend my professional life. The truth of the matter is that the reasons behind my choice of topic are wrapped up with my personal history and, in one way or another, have been forming for more than 30 years. On the evening of January 7th, 1985, my Cub Scout den was meeting at our house, and my parents, desiring to stay out of the den mother's way, headed out for a walk, taking a longer route than they normally would have taken. As they were walking down one of the few significantly steep hills in central Florida a few miles from our house, a bicyclist, ridden by a local high school student, no more than a child himself in the grand scheme of things, collided with my mother, knocking her to the ground, where she hit her head on the sidewalk pavement. She spent roughly 3 days in a coma before she died on January 10th. I was 9 years old. As a child, I was not aware of my grieving process, of how I dealt with a loss of such magnitude. I know I cried when my father, brother, and sister entered my parents' bedroom, where I was watching television, to tell me that my mother had finally died. My memories of that moment center on me burying my face in a jacket on the bed as they sat around me and struggled to break the news. I cried for a number of reasons, obviously, but I clearly remember seeing my father's tears and being startled and frightened by them. It was the first time I'd ever seen him cry. It was, in fact, the last time I'd seen him express his emotions in such a manner for many years. In the days and weeks that followed, at school, at the memorial service, at the funeral, I tried my best not to betray any of the emotions that threatened to undo me. I looked to my father for the roadmap out of my grief, and his directions, while never verbally expressed, were clear. We would do our best to put this tragedy behind us. Talking about our emotions, our grief, would be too overwhelming, too painful. My mother's presence permeated our house, filling the spaces between us, a life very much worthy of our grief, and yet we were somehow unwilling or incapable of publicly expressing these emotions. This is how I mourned my mother's death, stoically, in silence. In the words of Augustine, himself mourning the impending death of his mother, ego syllabam et fletum frenebam, I remained silent and restrained my tears. Now, more than 30 years later, I'm only beginning to understand how this loss and the way I grieved my mother's death shaped my identity. As it turns out, the way I grieved was heavily influenced by my gender, by my understanding, or to be more precise, by my father's understanding, which served as my model of what it meant to be a man, as well as the model of masculinity endorsed by the culture and community in which I was raised. Growing up as he did in the 1940s and 50s, my father's conception of masculinity was determined to a large extent by certain forms of cultural expression. Radio serials such as The Lone Ranger and The Shadow, and television series such as Roy Rogers and Hopalong Cassidy, which reflected in some ways the socially constructed notions of the masculine ideal, provided my father with models of masculine behavior to be, and they proved to be highly influential during his childhood. In fact, up to the end of his life, my father could recite the opening sequence of the Lone Ranger radio program, word for word, and he often did so with great joy and enthusiasm for him and embarrassment
for the rest of us. After high school, my father joined the Air Force, where he encountered a version of masculinity similar to the one embodied by the cowboy heroes of his youth. These two versions of the masculine ideal stressed characteristics such as strength, courage, honor, and loyalty. In attempting to emulate these models of masculinity, my father was participating in what the philosopher and gender theorist Judith Butler considers performativity. That is, he adopted and acted out the cultural norms of masculine behavior, or I should say that these norms dictated how he would behave. These norms were essentially the same when I was a child, and these, along with the model of my father's behavior, determined my own understanding of masculinity. And there exists within these cultural norms of masculinity that influence both my father and myself a persistent stereotype concerning the displays of emotions, one I'm sure you're all familiar with, and that's namely, men don't express their emotions. They remain, in the face of any emotionally charged situation, particularly grief, stoic. Just in short, to cite a well-worn cliche, which also happens to be the title of the book concerning gender stereotypes of grief, men don't cry, women do. The authors of this book, Terry Martin and Kenneth Doka, refer to this process of loss as an instrumental pattern of grief, which is distinguished by a physical rather than emotional reaction, such as restlessness or an attempt to stay busy. They contrast this pattern with an intuitive pattern of grief, which is characterized by an effective display of emotions. According to Martin and Doka, this is not, and this really isn't a surprising pronouncement, the instrumental pattern is typical of the way men grieve. In many respects, then, my grief as a child could be classified as instrumental. I did my best to stay busy, to keep my emotions to myself, to keep my mind off the situation in the weeks and months after my mother's death. My father, and indeed most of the adults in my family, encouraged this behavior by devising various ways to keep me entertained or occupied. Toys were bought, trips were planned to friends' houses or movies or amusement parks or things like that. And yet, this instrumental pattern did not fully, or perhaps even adequately, express or relieve the sorrow and loss I felt over my mother's death. To participate in the intuitive pattern of grief, however, seemed out of the question. I did not want to reveal my emotions for fear of letting my father and family down, appearing weak or, ironically enough, seeming childish. Even at a young age, I understood, or thought I did, how men were expected to behave. And certainly based on my father's and brother's examples, discussing feelings did not fit within these expectations. My brother and I talked to this day, but we often don't talk about our emotions. Instead, we make fun of each other, which I think is a suitable replacement. So my gender and my desire to conform to the models of behavior which surrounded me shaped and, as I have come to understand, limited my grief. As I matured, I began to participate in Martin and Doka's intuitive pattern a little bit more. I began to effectively express my emotions in a limited sense at first to a limited group of people. More recently, I have started to explore my grief more fully, especially through conversations with my sister and my mother's sisters. There is no denying, however, that the stereotypically masculine method of grieving influenced both my father's expression of grief as well as my own. Picture of me and my mother. So while this stereotype of masculine grief, like all stereotypes, failed, and continues to fail, to fully represent the diverse nature of my mourning process, which continues to evolve as I grow older, it nevertheless played a role in my expression of grief. Just as the expression of grief contributed to the formation of, or at least my own understanding of, my sense of self, the loss of my mother's presence in my life also affected my masculine identity. The exact nature of this loss is complex, and is something I am only beginning to comprehend. My mother's absence became a film covering my existence, blurring and obscuring how I was seen by others and how I saw myself. After her death, I was known to others, particularly in those in the community not directly connected with my family, as the boy whose mother died, or the boy who lost his mother, and this was long before Harry Potter. This became how I was identified, and much to my surprise, this identification continued long after I expected it to, well into college, actually. To the world around me, to those within my community, I was constituted by a lack, an absence. This absence not only affected the way I was seen by others, but the way I viewed myself. A large part of me was missing. In not knowing my mother, who she was, her life story, I was, or am, I find it difficult sometimes to determine which tense I should use, unable to know myself. So my loss was triple. I lost a loved one, a marker of identity which influenced how others saw me, and a sense of my own identity. My sense of loss and longing remains frustratingly difficult to express, and yet I continue to make the attempt. If I could pop my mother open, 1,000 memories would appear and move me, breaking and healing my heart, and making the world real again. Her unreality places the world so far away. Her unreality makes my life unreal. The mother I carry within me, present in her absence, ignites a longing, a desire to know her more fully, to know myself more fully, to know others more fully. It is a longing such as this, a desire to make my mother real again, which drives my quest to know her or myself. Hoping to regain my own identity, I struggle to fill in the absence left by her death. Bringing her back, though, of course, is impossible. In the process of trying to regain this piece of myself, however, I have learned to express my grief in ways other than the stereotypically masculine patterns modeled by my father. This, in turn, has brought me to a new and different understanding of who I am. I wanted to return for a moment to my father. I mentioned earlier that the first time I saw him cry was when I was 9, when he told me my mother had died. And then I hadn't seen him cry for a very long time after that. It wasn't until the end of his life, when the cancer had made an irrevocable claim over his body and the medications had drained him of his once vital spirit, that he was visited by unexpected bouts of weeping. He would be enjoying the company of friends and family one moment, telling stories about his days repossessing cars in Miami, say, and then he would suddenly burst into tears. When I first witnessed this, I found it to be incredibly disconcerting. I found myself back in my parents' bedroom in 1985, watching my father attempt to restrain his tears as he told me my mother was gone. Perhaps sensing my unease, my father tried to wipe his tears away, apologizing for what he clearly viewed as an embarrassing display of emotion. I did not ask him what was making him cry, because I already knew the answer. Nothing. Everything. Instead, I took hold of his hand and wept with him. That's an example of a sentence that hits you differently when you say it out loud, but when you read it in your head. That happens sometimes. And that is the last memory of my father. Two grown men who had spent several decades doing our best not to betray our emotions to each other, sitting silently, crying together. So we have issues of grief and masculinity and identity and desire and absence, and these are the issues which inhabit my life. These are the issues which inhabit my scholarly work. Why did I choose such a topic with which to spend my professional life? I don't believe necessarily that by examining masculine grief in the Middle Ages, I will discover some secret truth about my own grief. I do believe, however, that we can learn about ourselves through literature, even literature written over 500 years ago, a fact that I encourage my students to understand and that my colleagues do as well. Why did I choose such a topic to write about? Let me answer in the only way this question can be answered, with another question. How could I write about anything else? And so I have written about this. Which brings me to the topic of the collection that I've worked on during my sabbatical, as I mentioned before. The title is Knowing Sorrow, Grief, Gender, and Identity in the Middle Ages. Here is a brief sort of description of it, again, that you can occupy yourselves with as I prattle on here. But I'll talk a little bit in general about the study of grief and gender in the Middle Ages before moving into a specific discussion of the collection itself. So the topic of grief and gender and identity occupies a sort of interesting place within the study of the Middle Ages. The past several decades have witnessed a growth in the number of books published on the subjects of gender and emotions in the Middle Ages, yet very few of these examine the relationship between grief and gender identity. When this relationship is addressed, it often provokes a range of critical opinion. In the introduction to her collection entitled Grief and Gender 700 to 1700, the editor, Jennifer Vaught, articulates a common assumption regarding the connection between grief and gender. She says, quote, "Men at this time often vent their grief through violent action or respond stoically to loss, whereas women frequently mourn by weeping and wailing. Such a view suggests that there are clearly articulated, culturally sanctioned norms that govern the experience of masculine and feminine grief in the Middle Ages. And while this may be true to a certain extent, it certainly does not hold true for all instances of grief. If you've looked through any sort of medieval romance or story of King Arthur or Lancelot or anything like that, you will find a lot of men weeping in those romances. And most of the time, their tears are not viewed in a negative way. So, Vaught there refers specifically to the early modern period. The same, I think, though, can be said of the medieval period. Indeed, another historian, Ruth Mazocharis, argues that emotional displays, in particular the expression of grief by men, often include the weeping and wailing commonly associated with women. She writes, quote, "Public emotion on the part of knights and great lords was not frowned upon, but indeed admired. Even tears were not unmanly. It was manly to have deeply held feelings and important to display them." So on the one hand, we have the idea that men are going to respond to grief through violence or stoically, and on the other we have an assessment that says deeply held emotions and the display of those emotions were not only important but valued. These seemingly contrasting critical opinions highlight the relationship between grief and gender in the Middle Ages, one that is complex, nuanced, and far from absolute. And so this volume attempts to bring together a variety of texts that examine the ways in which gender identity is constructed, revised, and contested through displays of grief. Now I'll take a little detour here because I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that I touched on in the first part of my talk. And that's that connection between grief and identity, and to a certain extent, gender as well. And this connection is established by Freud, for those of you that are fans of his, and later revised by Judith Butler, the gender theorist I mentioned earlier. For Freud, loss and mourning, the cause of and subsequent process of coming to terms with grief, become essential, if not primary, components in the formation of identity, and specifically gender identity. In his essay, The Ego and the Id, Freud suggests that melancholia, which at this point in Freud's understanding is a necessary precondition for the mourning process, quote, has a great share in determining the form taken by the ego, and that it makes an essential contribution towards building up what is called its character. Losing the person one has loved causes the ego to incorporate the other into itself, sustaining the other through an identification with him or her. For Freud, the most important occurrence of this internalization, which characterizes the mourning process, is located in the early stages of life, when a child must endure the, quote, loss, unquote, of his or her mother or father due to the Oedipus complex. Freud says, quote, "In this way, the dissolution of the Oedipus complex would consolidate the masculinity in a boy's character. In a precisely analogous way, the outcome of the Oedipus attitude in a little girl may be an intensification of her identification with the mother. In this sense, then, gender identity emerges from what we might be able to consider an initial instance of grief." Judith Butler accepts Freud's understanding of grief in the mourning process as necessary in the acquisition of gender identity, but she revises Freud's assumption that it is solely the Oedipus complex that is responsible, and she instead suggests that the incest taboo also plays a role in contributing to gender identity, and it does so because it is linked with the taboo against homosexuality. So according to Butler, the loss for the child is the desire for the same-sex parent, which with the result that because of the prohibitions against homosexuality and incest, the child internalizes the lost parent by becoming the lost object, and that's denoting the same-sex parent, and thus establishing a gender identity. Butler's revision of Freud is crucial to her understanding of gender as a discursive construct, one that presents gender as natural and innate, when in fact it is constituted through the discursive practices of the cultural law, those behavioral norms that determine identity. And you can think of the radio programs and TV shows my father would watch as he grew up. Butler then, while agreeing with Freud that gender identity develops from a child's loss of a parent, suggests that this loss is not a naturally occurring phenomenon, but rather is caused by culturally created law. Hence, for Butler, gender is a cultural construct from the moment of its inception in grief. Both Freud and Butler then understand gender identity as evolving from a moment of grief, the loss in early childhood of a parent, and the ensuing process of mourning. If grief serves as the central factor in the initial formation of gender identity, then any subsequent expression of grief or mourning provides an opportunity to shape, solidify, subvert, or reshape identity even further. So the foundation of the collection that I'm working on rests on sort of these two concepts articulated by Freud, although none of the essays approach it in this sort of psychoanalytic type of way. But those two central issues are that grief plays a central role in the formation of identity in general, and gender identity in particular, and that gender and identity are culturally constructed. In other words, they're not innate or essential. The central concern of our collection is the question of how grief relates to gender identity in the Middle Ages, and how men and women perform this grief within or against specific cultural expectations of gender. And there were those, just as there are today. The Middle Ages, we could find dozens of examples of these sort of culturally constructed models for masculinity and femininity that any given community would sort of expect to adhere to. So when we think about it in this way, the collection then can be placed within the larger field of the history and comparative study of emotions. Recent scholars of the history of emotions understand that emotions, much like gender, are socially and culturally produced. Barbara Rosenwein explains, in summarizing social constructionist theories of emotions, that all emotions are, quote, the products of experience, and experience itself is shaped by the practices and norms of a person's household, neighborhood, and larger society. Rosenwein herself argues for the existence of what she refers to as emotional communities, that is, groups in which people adhere to the same norms of emotional expression and value, or devalue the same or related emotions. More than one emotional community may exist. Indeed, normally many do exist at the same time. And these communities may change over time as well. So by examining specific literary, historical, and religious representations of grief and gender, as the essays in this collection do, can help reveal not only what the emotional and gender expectations are for certain groups in the Middle Ages, but also how these are upheld, contested, or revised. So I can show you the table of contents there. So the essays collected here explore a number of important questions about grief, gender, and identity. Some of those questions include, how is grief represented in literary, historical, and religious discourses in the Middle Ages? How are these representations informed and or constrained by gender? What role does gender play in public and private displays of grief? What are the culturally sanctioned norms for expression of grief by men and women in the Middle Ages? How do representations of grief reveal dissonances, contradictions, and anxieties surrounding culturally sanctioned gender norms? And what is at stake in terms of identity in general and gender identity in particular in any given expression of grief? Are the instances of grief in medieval texts merely a representation of a universal human emotion, a way of articulating the pain, anger, and confusion which attend loss? Or are they sites of a complex negotiation between gender and identity? Do certain types of gendered grief enjoy a privileged place within medieval texts? For instance, is masculine grief valued or devalued more than feminine grief is? Are these moments of grief presented without question, taken at face value and presumed to signify nothing beyond what lies at the surface level of articulation? Are these moments of grief safely contained at the scene of their inception, or do their effects permeate the text and even the larger community in which they occur? So that's the goal, sort of the collection, is to explore many of these questions. And as you would expect, there is not one simple answer to all of those questions. There are, in fact, multiple and multifaceted responses. So what we are interested in, and what I sort of look for when choosing the contributors, was those essays that not only sort of describe how men and women grieve in the Middle Ages, but also then interrogate the ways that grief affects their gender identity. And so we have 11 chapters now. I started out with 15, and then people disappeared on me. If you've worked with at collected editions, you know people disappear. Some people are nice and say they can't complete the manuscript on time. Some people just go missing, and you email them and then they never respond. One person wrote me and said, so as I was writing my chapter, I realized I'm not really making an original argument. Is that okay? You know, if you know anything about scholarship and humanities, you kind of have to make an original argument. So I had to tell that guy, no, it's not okay. You're out of luck. So we whittled it down to 11. People told me when I started this that it's easier just to write a book yourself than to edit a collection. And I said, that's nonsense. I only have to do one chapter in the introduction. I think they might be right. Because you have to deal with all these other people and their sort of roadblocks and their delays and everything else. And so that has been one of the bigger challenges for me, is sort of navigating that and sort of being the, I guess, the ringleader of this circus that may eventually come to fruition. The other interesting thing that I like about this is that it does collect a number of both methodological approaches. So we have some history at work here, primarily in that first chapter, which talks about medieval Castilian history writing and the way that grief and emotion is sort of displayed there. We also have some attempts at looking at it from a more religious point of view, particularly in chapters 2 and 3. The dispute between Mary and the cross is a Middle English poem, which is just that. Mary sort of starts blaming the cross in her grief for her son's death, and the cross speaks back to Mary and sort of tries to gently, at some times, not so gently at others, instruct her on the proper ways that she should be grieving. So we see in that text a sort of both a presentation of what this emotional community, which would be early Christian community, would expect the norms of both grief and gender to be. And then we see some of those norms and expectations challenged by Mary in her own grief. And something similar happens in the text that is in chapter 3, which is the bronze sacrifice of Isaac, which is a medieval mystery play. So it tells the story of Isaac and that Jew that sacrificed Isaac. Abraham, right? All right, whatever. Clearly, I probably need to touch up on my knowledge a little bit. So we have historical, we have some religious. I had an art history chapter that disappeared on me, which would have been really nice to have. But then we also have different sort of cultural attempts at viewing this as well. So we do have Spanish, we do have English and British, but we also have a few that look at Irish texts, so chapters 7 and 8. The Ulster Cycle and this Gaelic text about blood drinking. Then we also have some sort of Norse or Scandinavian texts that are looked at specifically in chapter 6, Gender and Death from Grief in Medieval Scandinavian texts. And then I ended it with sort of a sort of middle ground, or a bridge piece, I think I should say, that looks at grief both in medieval texts but also in Shakespeare, particularly Macbeth. And I think that helps us sort of point towards the early modern period as a collection. So I can certainly answer more specific questions about the process of putting together an edited collection if you'd like. I can certainly answer questions about sort of the theoretical underpinnings of gender and identity and grief that I work with. Or we could just go in lemon squares. But thank you anyway for your patience. Are there questions? Perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering about
Yeah, right. So my chapter 10, I'm writing on the Middle English poem Sir Orfeo, which is essentially a retelling of the Orpheus legend. And if you're familiar with the Orpheus legend, Orpheus, this great sort of musician, loses his wife to Hades and travels down into the underworld to return or to get her back. Right? There's a Middle English version of this, which sort of translates Orfeo from ancient Greece into medieval England. And in that text, Orfeo's sort of display of grief takes the form of him playing his harp. Right? He sort of abandons all markers of his identity. He's presented in the text at the beginning as a king and the leader and ruler of a kingdom. And when his wife is taken, he abandons that identity. He leaves his kingdom, he renounces his right to rule, he leaves everything behind him except for his harp and this sort of pilgrim's cloak, and he wanders out into the wilderness. And his grief takes the form of singing. So we can call it singing, sort of connects to that. And I probably had that spelled out a bit more clearly in my talk, but thank you for asking.
So that'd be like medieval blues?
Yeah, it could be in some ways, yeah. The interesting thing about the Middle English Sir Orfeo is that he gets his wife back. In the ancient Greek legend, he at first gets her back, and the stipulation is, you can take her out of hell, but you can't look back. And if you look back, you lose it forever. And he does look back. He does lose it forever. In Sir Orfeo, he manages to save his wife from the fairy kingdom and brings her back to his kingdom and regains his throne. And it seems like a very happy ending. But there are some problems with the ending, in that his wife never speaks again after she's sort of restored to him. And they die childless, right? And so that further sort of undermines his masculine identity at the end, because it is very much important for kings to have children, male children in particular, to pass on the title. So there's a lot going on there that I do obviously explore in a bit more detail. Yeah, Chad.
I have a question about, and I apologize if this gets out of your range a little bit too far.
Mm-hmm.
So feel free to use that's beyond the scope of this answer. But I thought the talk was very good, very interesting, and I'm very grateful for it. My question is about the Freud.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have any loss as a young person, can you then form the gender identity? In other words, now that people live to 80, 90, and 100 years old, how do small children create?
Yeah, so for Freud, that loss it wasn't an actual loss through death or absence, right? It was having to give up the attachment to one parent causes you to identify. So in the Oedipus complex, for example, a young boy would be attracted to or attached to his mother, and then that sort of cultural law kicks in, and so transmits his affection to his father, and then begins to form his identity in relation to his father, right? So that loss of the mother there. And then Butler comes in and says that, but also add on top of it prohibitions against homosexuality and incest, further strengthen the male-to-male sort of model, female-to-female model, right? And so that loss is a much more sort of metaphoric type of loss, but it is a loss, as I read it, and instigates what I think happens when we do encounter an actual loss through death, right? In that our identities are relational in many ways, right? In other words, we know ourselves through the way others see us and know us. And we define ourselves in relation to others. And so when we lose someone, we lose not only a loved one, but we lose a sort of part of our own understanding of who we are and our identity, right? And so that grief then instigates this sort of attempt to find ways to fill that hole, right? And so in Orfeo's case, for instance, his way is to sort of completely reject all aspects of his former identity and adopt a completely new one. And so he's creating wholesale a sort of alternate version of masculinity in that tale than the one that would have sort of been the culturally sanctioned, I guess. Does that answer your question, son?
It actually, and even in terms of Freud's own biography, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
He saw his father humiliated in front of him,
Oh,
on the Walk in the Woods one by Goy.
let me, there first, and then we'll get to
Has your realization of the role your own experiences played in shaping your scholarly interests, has that impacted your teaching? I mean, do you now encourage students to be more cognizant of their own experiences when they're choosing things to study, things to write about?
I think so. I mean, I think that has always kind of been the case, and I think, Jim and Steve can talk to this and Julie as well, and Mike. We do certainly in writing classes ask our students sometimes to write about their own experiences as a way to get them connected to the material. And usually those are like personal narrative type of essays, so it does make sense that you're writing about your own personal experiences. When it comes to the scholarship, the sort of more scholarly side of things, I don't think I necessarily have, beyond maybe, sort of asking students what interests them about a particular text, or what they might be able to connect with, and then from there try to explore it. But I can't say that I really have attempted to sort of pursue that way of viewing it, and maybe sort of not impose it on students, but help them better understand that. Yeah.
This is not so much a question, it's a comment. So I was very excited. I just got it. It's a DVD documentary. It's called "In the Mask We Live In."
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
I have, yeah.
Okay. Is it related at all?
Yeah, no, it talks about a lot of the same issues, right? This idea that, this idea of masculinity and the way it's presented and really constructed in our culture, well, in any culture, really, really shapes the way that from a very young age, boys sort of understand what it means to be a man, right? And obviously the same occurs for women, I think. But this idea that it, so if we wanted to get really into Judith Butler, she'd say, it's those discourses, all that sort of stuff that surrounds us, that is actually shaping our identity, right? That we think we're making choices, but we're not, right? And that's part of the way it works, is that it presents it as a choice, or presents it as something that's, well, this is just the way men are, like this sort of natural, essentialist type of argument, but it's not, right? I mean, and so the discourse creates its own legitimacy by sort of forcing us to sort of assume that this is the way it's always been, and therefore this is the way men have to act. And then when men don't act that way, or when women don't act that way, you go, whoa, that's not right. But it's just, yeah, so it does explore some of those ideas. I don't nail that too closely.
Do you think that societal status in the Middle Ages affected how positively or negatively people looked at men showing emotions? And are there any examples of female fictional heroes or real life figures that had a different sort of status, whether knight or monarch, that showed a different kind of emotion that people looked in a different way at, depending on their status?
Yes, and so your different class communities would ultimately be part of those emotional communities that Barbara Rosewarne talks about, and they would have certain expectations, right? And so, like noblemen would have a certain set of expectations about what it meant to be men, but perhaps monks, for example, right? The community of cloistered men, religious men, would have a different set of expectations and would therefore perhaps have different sort of models for grief or expression of emotion. There is in the Middle Ages the growth of this something called affective spirituality, right? Where we try to sort of feel what Christ would have felt and the suffering that he felt, which often led to emotional outbursts. There's a woman, writer Marjorie Kemp, who wrote about her life experience, and she's always crying. I mean, she's crying all the time. And I mean, anything, she sees someone who she thinks reminds her of Jesus, and she'll burst into tears, right? And what's interesting is a lot of the reactions of the male church authorities to her public displays of sorrow and weeping. They're very uncomfortable. They say, this is not proper, you do not do this right. And she's very unapologetic about her weeping. She'll just weep and cry all she wants. So yeah, depending on your community, there would be different sort of expectations, even within a community. So there's a poem called The Alliterative Morte Arthur, which tells a certain part of the Arthur story, right? Really sort of the early parts of the Arthur story. And there's a moment in that story when Arthur's best knight in this text, which is Gawain, dies. And Arthur is completely devastated by this. He falls to the ground, he weeps and cries, he grasps Gawain's body, bloodies his beard with the blood of Gawain in his grief. And his men, the other nobles around him, say to him, stop it, you're acting like a woman, right? This is not proper for a king. So even within that community, we see two sort of different outlooks. Arthur responds by saying, it's perfectly proper for me to do this. But the next thing he does is he goes out and he kills a lot of people, right? So it might allow him to say, I can weep, if he then goes out and responds to his grief through this violent display. So yeah, we do see quite a bit. I mean, and that's sort of the thing that I think it's common for people when we think about an era like the Middle Ages to think of things as being very sort of, a sort of monolithic type of belief about things. And so this idea that, oh, men wouldn't cry back then, or only women cried, is again that sort of stereotype. But we have texts that show a range of different approaches and the different responses to those displays of grief, which complicate it, obviously, in interesting ways for me. Yes?
One short question and comment. For chapter 2, when is the date for the dispute between
Off the top of my head, I'm drawing a blank. I want to say it's pre. It's yeah. It's probably in the 14th century.
Okay.
Yeah, I think. I could double check that for you.
Okay.
But off the top of my head, I don't.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
The comment is that thank you so much, and this was super interesting, especially for me because I'm a early Christianity and late antiquity. That field, this exactly the theme that you are exploring is really hot issue, hot topic there. So the emotions and laws and grief and the gender, and then that is really, really important there, and especially like in early Christianity martyrdom, the loss of their children and their parents, and how people can really express their emotions in a proper way,
Right.
and how is it connected with gender, and what constitutes to be proper human being. So that's really important. So.
Yeah, and I didn't do this on purpose, although I'm less interested in sort of the religious or philosophical consolations to grief. And we do see that in quite a bit of medieval texts, this sort of idea of, well, do not mourn for those who are gone because they've gone to a better place, and you should be happy for them. I don't like it because I think it sort of minimizes that human experience. And
Right.
and I didn't, though, when I set out the call for paper, sort of specifically say I would like to avoid any approaches that take that time. But none of them really do. I mean, even in the ones that deal with the dispute between Mary and the cross and the sacrifice of Isaac, it's not so much of, you must, or it's not, the authors of these two chapters, I should say, are not arguing that these texts are saying you must sort of respond in this philosophical or even offering a consolation in that way. And that they really do, especially in the dispute between Mary and the cross. Mary really is just, she's just broken, right? And you see her anger and you see her confusion and all these sorts of things. And the cross is fulfilling that sort of role of saying, okay, well, let's try to move you back into this more, I don't know what word I want to use for it, helpful or legitimized type of grief. But yes, it is interesting stuff. Other? Yes, Mary.
Has this particular topic of gender relationship to things like grief in modern times, always been an area of study, or is it perhaps increasing in any way with the fact that just the whole concept of gender and looking at it from various different angles and publicly talking about things has sort of exploded in recent years?
Well, so yeah, it is a field that has been growing probably the past, certainly the past quarter of the 20th century up to now, and maybe probably even a little bit before then. But yeah, the sort of the focus on gender studies sort of grows out of feminist philosophy and critique. And then as that sort of grows, people in other disciplines sort of say, hey, we're like kind of opportunists. We're like, hey, that's like John said, that's a hot topic. Maybe I should look into that. And so we are seeing it more, right? I particularly focus my research on masculinity in grief, right? And so I'm narrowing it down a little bit further. And I think the trend has been, when people talk about grief and gender, it's usually been sort of feminine grief and displays of feminine grief rather than masculine grief. So the explorations of masculine grief are not as common yet as feminine grief, but it is certainly something that it continues to be sort of investigated more. So we're seeing an explosion of sort of studies about it now.
Thank you.
There are lots of questions. Just
If I could bring it down to the undergraduate level.
Sure.
As a teacher of gender studies here, what I find interesting is that no matter what I do in the classroom, the class always wants to talk about men behaving like women, and usually as a negative. And it's very difficult to get them to move in the other direction and look for the masculine, except for the stereotype that women can now be aggressive.
Right.
One of the things I do. So I'm just wondering, when you deal with the same students I deal with, how you try to get them to see, I mean, it's hard enough to get them to see gender as a culturally learned behavior, not a biological fact.
right.
And in fact, it's impossible to get some of them to see that. So I'm just wondering if you have the same experience and how it works. Plus, I can't ask anything about the medieval texts, because I don't know anything
Right.
about them. And
Well,
I'll
no.
talk to you about your own grief
Yeah.
later. So the only thing I can really ask about is my experience, which interested.
I have a similar experience, and it's true that there are the moments when men are acting. And so I'm teaching Arthurian lit class right now, and so we've read a number of Arthurian romances, and the men in these Arthurian romances, right? What I think our students view as stereotypical masculine, knights in shining armor. They're weeping a lot. They're complaining about being sad, because their lover is not near them. And I've gotten comments of like, well, they're acting like a wimp, or they're acting, like a woman. And I do have trouble sort of saying, yes, but that is not viewed as a negative in this text. And in fact, it wouldn't have been viewed as negative in the culture and the audience reading this text. That sort of devotion to love and its effects on someone were seen as positives, right? And they just can't get that. We're going to start a French text called Silence, in which a girl is raised as a boy, and she sort of has to live her life as a knight. And so I'm going to be interested to see if they do, like you say, if they do seem to have a better or easier time to see women acting aggressive or women fighting, right? That's okay for them. But still, to see men showing emotion in these texts does cause them confusion. And I don't think I have a way of getting them to understand that, but I think it speaks to that sort of idea that they think this is what men are supposed to behave like in a lot of ways. So that doesn't quite answer the question.
Well, there is no answer.
Yeah.
Do you ever talk about modern day melodramas or superheroes or comics or anything? Because the superheroes always like, oh, I can't be with this person.
Right.
And
This sort of,
that
it's
kind of
noble
stuff.
sacrifice.
Or Batman is
Right.
grief, like,
Yeah, and it's grief expressed through violence,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it is stereotypical. I'm going to go punch people in the face because I'm sad. Well, that might be reduced.
but like the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, they're very popular, but at the same time, there's a lot of people complaining, oh, he cries too much. and
Right.
stuff.
Yeah, actually, I don't. Yeah, it doesn't come up much. But I think certainly that would be one way that you can approach talking about cultural sort of constructions of gender, right? I mean, because it is things like comic books and movies that are providing those models. And what would be interesting is to look at, you know, from the golden age of comics, the depictions of the male heroes versus now.
Yeah.
Right, and so, you know, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and all those people were presenting us with probably a very sort of representative, you know, square-jawed Captain America type of man. And now the men, are there differences in the way the men superheroes are represented, right? That would be an interesting thing to look at, I think. But I don't teach a class.
And the problem with is that the readers that I deal with, miss. They
Yes.
ignore the man behaving like a woman unless you bring it up. So I'm
Right.
wondering, even in your class, if you weren't a gender studies person, they
Right.
might have just, they just don't see it.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean,
And then they get irritated at me if I make them see it.
yes. Why are we always talking about those things? Why can't we talk
You
about anything
made
else?
that up, it's fake news.
Yes, it is. Right. Well, that's what we all do. Other questions? Yeah, Mike.
This is different from what they're asking, but I kind of was curious about your role as editor.
Yeah.
You know, how you, I know you said something about you had the call for papers type thing, and you lost some, well, you didn't really lose papers, you kind of lost people.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about how you constructed it as far as, you know, like what you asked for to get such a mix of things that you got there, kind of what you lost and
Right.
and maybe even what you cut? I mean, were there things that you sort of were like, yeah, this just doesn't go?
Yeah, so the process is, you know, I had to write a call for papers and sort of say, I'm looking for papers that express or explore issues of grief and gender in the Middle Ages across, you know, I said I wanted to be multidisciplinary, but I did want it to have a focus on the Middle Ages, so I didn't want anything from early modern. And I posted that in all the places that one would post that, Facebook. And I got a lot of submissions, right? So my first job was to sort of read through all of their abstracts and decide which ones I want and which ones aren't going to work. And when I started, I didn't necessarily know, right? Because I think, like all of us as writers, we often don't know what it is we want to do until we've started the writing process a little bit. And so, you know, it took me several months to read through them and reread through them and begin to sort of tease out connections between some of the papers. And once I began to say, all right, well, now I've got a nice sort of array of sort of methodological approaches, so some history, art history, religion, things like that, I began looking at what texts these people were going to look at. So I had a lot of people write abstracts about, it's Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, right? And I chose one that I really liked. And all the others dealt with very similar issues to that one that I had chosen. So I didn't feel like including another one of those papers would have necessarily provided a different look at that issue, so I sort of had to put those aside. I kind of wish I had kept at least one more, because one of the papers I lost was the Chaucer paper. And so at that point I was too far gone to sort of go back to anyone. I lost someone early on who was very, I mean, just, this is the way you should act as a contributor to a collection. Let me know ahead of time, I mean, right away, right? I'm having difficulties, I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. Let me find you a replacement essay. And I was like, well, that seems odd, but okay. And so she managed to find me another essay about a similar topic, Irish literature, so that I was able to replace with a like essay. And so I didn't feel like I lost something there. The others, though, I lost that I didn't have time to replace. And so part of it was I wanted a range of approaches. I wanted a range of different texts. And I wanted ones that seemed like they were approaching both the topic of grief and gender in similar ways, but not so similar that we didn't have a number of different perspectives. Now, I still kind of, you know, we'll see how successful I was in choosing the essays, right? I mean, I could think it's great, but, you know, when that external reviewer reads the manuscript, they could say, why in the heck did you choose these? They don't work. And I'll have to say, well, go edit your own collection. But yeah, it's a lot of that sort of work. And in terms of editing the actual text, I kind of stayed hands-off to a certain degree. One, these are professional scholars, so we can assume that they can write. It's not always the case. And so my comments were sort of asking them to maybe bring out areas of their argument that I thought connected with others, so that we could sort of have those ties a little bit more closely. But I say I expected them to write, but it was surprising to me at how, I mean, they're almost like our students at how bad they are at like proofreading their manuscript before they send it in. I mean, there was one that just, I pulled it up and nothing but red squiggly lines. I'm like, did you not read this before you? And I don't know if it made me feel better about our students or worse about my profession that this was the case. But it was an interesting experience. I really enjoyed that experience of sort of, connecting these ideas and these people's work and organizing them together. But it is work. I mean, it's more work than that. We could certainly continue conversations afterwards. I know we have places to be, but thank you again for coming.